Hi, I'm Dave Sobel, and on this episode of What I Tell Investors, I'm going to address what I consider the threats to the managed services provider space. Talk a little bit about threats to the providers themselves, as well as some of the threats to the vendors in this space. This is a briefing of what I tell investors. So, as I think about this space, I get asked a lot of investors, what do I think the big threats are? The first one that I want to talk about is the conversion to the cloud. For me, there's a big gap in what's happening around cloud management. We have a very well defined ecosystem of supporting devices, but not one of supporting cloud services. There's a gap here. Most of the time, MSPs are what I consider assemblers, not builders. They are just simply different. A builder is a vendor that creates something. They create some new thing, a piece of software. They create a product, a laptop, a device, a cloud service. An assembler takes pre-existing things and combines them to create a solution. It's where the word solution provider comes from. They must assemble things. What we're seeing is a lag between the builders creating tools to do cloud management, particularly for SMB, and where the assemblers are and what they need. This has caused a gap of where they are in terms of implementation. As we've moved more and more services into the cloud, we don't actually have all of the SMB focused tools for multi-cloud management. I consider this a real gap and a real opportunity for people to move into. But ultimately, it actually is one of the big disruptive forces where I think that lack of innovation and that lack of drive is causing a weakness in the market. These IT service providers and MSPs are not fully armed to manage all of the scale of multiple clouds, and we haven't thought about that from a security perspective. I'll get into security risks next, but I actually view that this space of cloud management both as an opportunity, but I actually also view it as something of a risk for this space. That until this gets defined better, we're going to have a real weakness in the ability to deliver the core function of value of a managed services provider and an IT services provider. So for me, this is one area of risk for the space. From a vendor perspective on cloud management, it's actually also important to note that I see this as one of those areas of disruption. I get asked oftentimes about the incumbents in this space, the so-called big four MSP providers, as well as some of the established MSP focused software vendors. And I think this gap of cloud management is going to get exploited either by new upstarts or somebody like Microsoft. If you look at what Microsoft is doing with Intune and Endpoint Manager, they're clearly building an end-to-end management solution for all of their stuff and the expanded ecosystem around it. And I think that's a disruptive force that will be a threat in this space. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about security as one of the big risks. That I think that this area of space is actually more risk than opportunity right now, particularly for IT services providers. They're being asked to do a lot of things from a security perspective. The vendors, the software suppliers, the hardware suppliers, they're not looking to take on the liability for the use of their products. They have very well written end user license agreements that protects them from it. We have insurance companies that are starting to add additional layers of protection so that they're not going to be taking on more and more risk. They're also coming to terms with the fact that cyber insurance is a real risk area for them, and their market isn't capitalized enough to actually absorb all the risk they're taking, and they're pushing back. And we're also going to see some elements of regulation move into this space. And I think all of that is creating pressures on these small providers where security is pitched as a big opportunity, but it comes with an awful lot of risk. And I don't think necessarily that risk is particularly well managed. And I think that's a space of real risk for this entire services community. I'm going to talk a little bit about a tools disjoint that I see. That for me, one of the big things that's missing in a lot of the ways that we manage environments is the basic concept of the user. It's actually a real gap in the marketplace where most systems represent devices, or they represent endpoints, or they represent systems, but they oftentimes don't take into account a user and all of the services that a user might engage with. And that lack of understanding of the concept of a user makes things really difficult to systemize as you think about the management from a business side. We have all these systems and we think about software and we think about their components and their endpoints, but we actually don't have a unifying representation of a user that brings it all together. And this is another area where I think there's some weakness, and that exposure is a threat to this space. Obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't say all of these threats are opportunities as well, but that's one that I think about a lot. The other big threat that I see here is actually insurance companies. Interestingly, as this space has evolved, cyber insurance is becoming a growing portion of this, but they're going to be less partners and more pushback. Insurance companies aren't in the position to take endless risk, of which the IT service provider has essentially been asked to do. And they're going to push back, and they're going to push back hard in terms of making sure that they're limiting. They may stop paying out ransoms. They may start limiting the controls on this. They may start dictating to this space how it will deliver its services. I think that both the providers themselves will be impacted by this, but I also think at some point the vendors are going to be impacted by that. They're going to start being constrained on the way that they can deploy or build systems based on insurance requirements upstream from them. So I look at the insurers and actually see that they're going to be kind of disruptive in terms of the way that they press this space. And for me, that's another area of real concern to think about from a threat perspective. Final space on this is misalignment. One of the interesting things, and why I always initially loved the managed services model, was the perceived alignment between the customer and the provider. The MSP is motivated to give uptime in exchange for money, and now that is what the customer also wanted. But what's interesting is that inherent in that is a disassociation to advance. The MSP becomes very motivated to standardize, and standardization and implementation of procedures means controlling things at a level that actually does stifle innovation. You are disincentivized to make changes when uptime and reliability are the metrics. That disconnect over time has started to grow more and more, particularly as we systemize and best practice everything. And I think that misalignment is causing many providers to overcompensate on their monthly recurring revenue investment and not understand the core component of the fact that they have to continually innovate to keep that offering relevant and push forward. It's also some of why I think we're seeing the gap in terms of their push to things like the cloud, because it actually damages their core business. They may be resistant to move away from things that are traditionally very profitable for them and that they have highly standardized to some new disruptive factor because it is bad for their business. That now takes them out of alignment with their customers. And for me, that's actually one area that over time I think is becoming more and more problematic as this push to everything must be a managed service also disincentivize innovation. You've got to find the right balance. That's not to say it's either extreme, but it's actually a balance, and the balance is hard to execute on. So for me, that's another area where this push for the incentivization of standardization and to keep everything established actually disincentivizes the investment. As this market has matured, that becomes more and more of a pressure, and you face more and more of the innovator's dilemma of having to transform your business. So that's another area where I think this is problematic. Now, anybody who's watched my channel knows that I actually am pretty bullish on this. Let me say what I am bullish on is the core value. The core value of an IT services company is to help a small company with their technology needs. I think that value proposition remains very, very strong. But note that isn't linked to any particular technology, any particular implementation, any particular nomenclature. The classic idea of managed services, for example, particularly as it comes into device management, is not in what I define as the core value of a good IT services company. That's important to separate out. But I do think that that core value will continue to always be relevant. It's ensuring that you're delivering on that and not held to previous assumptions. As we move towards a cloud first, cloud implemented environment, you've got to make sure that you're transforming those pieces. And I think that leaves my last sort of risk to this space is established companies that are not willing to do their own transformation to move forward. That's becoming growing risk area for this space, incentivized in some ways by vendors that are happy to keep them that way because their own software is built around that model. That dynamic is a real risk to this space. Now, any savvy investor is going to be looking at this saying that's also a recipe for disruption, and one of the areas where I have called out as a big opportunity that I do see there will be a disruption in this, but these are the market conditions in terms of risks that I look for right now. Thanks for listening. If you like it, go ahead and hit like. Hit that subscribe button. I do a ton of material covering the IT services market, and I deliver a daily podcast called The Business of Tech, which is all the news about technology through the lens of those IT service providers. So if you're interested in learning more, you can listen to the issues that matter to them and go from there. There's videos here on the YouTube channel giving you insights into the kind of issues that they are providing and what they're thinking about in terms of the way they deliver their services. If you need more information, go ahead and visit mspradio.com. You can reach out and get in touch with me, and I'm always happy to answer more questions. Thanks for listening.